6 minutes to 3 in the morning. Friday, the 12th of October, 1984. Room 629 of the Grand Hotel, Brighton. A long-delayed bomb hidden in the wall cavity behind the bath panel. Its timer set 24 days earlier and left to run. The room is empty. The man who placed it had registered under the name Roy Walsh on the 15th of September and checked out on the 18th. He used a false name. He paid in cash. The bomb has been waiting for the Conservative Party conference. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is 2 floors below in the Napoleon suite, working on a speech she is scheduled to deliver in 7 hours. At 6 minutes to 3, the device fires. Floors collapse. The central chimney stack drives through several stories of the building. She has just left the bathroom. 5 other people across the building aren't as fortunate. The man who placed the bomb is in Cork. He does not yet know whether he has killed her. The IRA issued a statement widely attributed to that morning, declaring that while they had been unlucky on this occasion, they needed only to be lucky once, while the British government would have to be lucky always. The campaign that produced that bomb didn't begin in Brighton and didn't end there. It ran for more than 2 decades, killed approximately 175 people on the British mainland, consumed somewhere between 5 and 8 billion pounds in damage, security expenditure and intelligence operations, and ended not in British military victory, but in a negotiated settlement. Understanding why it ended when it did requires starting 7 years earlier, with a document that Irish police found on a man they arrested in December 1977. That man was Seamus Toomey, the IRA's Chief of Staff. Dublin's Special Branch seized the document from him at his arrest. It became known as the Staff Report. The document prescribed a structural revolution. The IRA's existing hierarchy, companies, battalions, brigades, was too large, too permeable, and too vulnerable to the attrition of arrests and informants. The Staff Report prescribed its replacement with a cell-based model. Units of 4 or 5 people, compartmentalised to the point where any single member's arrest couldn't unravel more than their immediate cell. A new Northern Command would replace GHQ as the primary operational coordinating body. The reorganisation had already begun in Belfast by the spring of 1977. The Staff Report was its written formalisation. What the document represented was a generation change in strategic thinking. The IRA officers emerging around Gerry Adams, who joined the Army Council in 1977, had watched the 1975 ceasefire produce nothing and conclude in humiliation. Adams had opposed that ceasefire while it was running. His generation drew a specific conclusion. A negotiated settlement that fell short of British withdrawal was unacceptable, and a swift military victory was unreachable. What remained was a third course, a sustained campaign of attrition, military operations combined with political work that would raise the cost of British presence in Ireland until withdrawal became the cheaper option. The older Republican leadership, represented most clearly by Ruairi O'Brodig, had been the architect of the 1975 ceasefire. Adams had opposed him throughout it. By 1977, the generational argument was settled in the younger leadership's favour, documented across Ed Maloney's A Secret History of the IRA and Eamon Malley and Patrick Bishop's The Provisional IRA. The restructuring the Staff Report prescribed was the Adams generation's organisational expression of their strategic victory. The logic of targeting mainland Britain was embedded in the same framework. Academic analysis of the IRA's own economic doctrine summarises it precisely. A bombing campaign aimed at making the enemy's financial interest in the country unprofitable, while at the same time curbing long-term investment. Northern Ireland's subvention already cost the British Treasury approximately £1 billion annually. The strategic value of mainland operations was their multiplier effect. A bomb in the City of London would be priced by financial markets before Cabinet convened. Its damage would appear on insurance ledgers, in business continuity assessments, in the cost calculations of every institution operating in Britain. Operations in South Armagh wouldn't produce those calculations. The IRA already had an England department. What the cell restructuring created were the conditions for running it at scale, with greater operational security over a longer period than any previous English campaign had managed. On the 20th of July 1982, the campaign demonstrated exactly what that meant. The morning was warm and clear. The route through Hyde Park was a public one, lined with spectators, a routine part of London's ceremonial calendar. The household cavalry, the Blues and Royals, conducted their mounted parade along South Carriage Drive at approximately 10:40. The soldiers were in full ceremonial dress. The horses were trained for crowds and noise. The bomb had been placed in a parked car on the route. It was packed with gelignite and metal fragments, nails, bolts, the kind of fragmentation load designed to maximize casualties in an open space where crowds would gather. When it detonated, the horses had nowhere to go. The blast drove metal through flesh at chest height. 4 soldiers were killed. 7 horses died in the blast or had to be destroyed at the scene. Soldiers and bystanders on foot sustained injuries across a wide area. 28 injured in total, according to one account. 2 hours and 12 minutes later, at 12:55 in the afternoon, a second bomb detonated under the bandstand in Regent's Park. The Royal Green Jackets band was mid-performance. The audience was civilian. Londoners eating lunch, families with children, the kind of crowd that gathers around an open-air concert on a summer day. The device had been concealed beneath the bandstand structure overnight or earlier. 7 bandsmen were killed. Several were killed mid-performance, in uniform, holding their instruments. Others died in the following hours. 11 soldiers dead in one morning. 2 bombs, 2 public parks, 2 hours apart. The targets were chosen precisely because they were simultaneously military and symbolic. The household cavalry's ceremonial function, the military band performing for a civilian audience, in ways that would generate maximum visibility. This was central London. This was a civilian concert. One of the horses that survived the Hyde Park blast had sustained 38 penetrating wounds. A metal fragment had severed a main artery in his neck. His name was Sefton. Emergency veterinary surgery kept him alive through the night. He returned to duty on the 29th of September 1982 to BBC coverage and national press attention. Sefton became the dominant public image of the Hyde Park attack, which the IRA's political strategists would have noted with discomfort. The campaign was generating the kind of British emotional response that was supposed to translate into political pressure for withdrawal, but was instead consolidating national identification with those it had harmed. 2 years later, the campaign escalated to a target no previous mainland operation had attempted. Patrick Magee was born in Belfast in 1951. He moved with his family to Norwich as a child and returned to Belfast in 1969, aged 18, as the Troubles were beginning. He joined the Provisional IRA in 1972 and was interned without trial at Long Kesh from 1973 to 1975. By 1984, he had been a committed volunteer for more than a decade, wanted by British authorities, operating on the run. In his own account, he described the IRA as fully committed, after earlier strategic disagreements, to taking the war to England as its single most effective strategy. Brighton was his expression of that conviction. He checked into the Grand Hotel on the 15th of September 1984 under the name Roy Walsh, room 629. He placed the device behind the bath panel in the wall cavity, not the bath itself, but the structural void behind it, accessed by removing the panel and replacing it. Routine daily cleaning wouldn't find it there. The device wouldn't be disturbed by chambering staff. The timer was a Memo Park parking meter timer, adapted for long delay use. He checked out on the 18th of September, leaving the bomb in the wall 24 days before the conference, with the fuse set to run. In his own account, published in Jacobin in March 2021 and forming the basis of his 2021 memoir, Where Grieving Begins, McGee described the charge as consisting of 100 pounds of gelignite, not the figure reported by British authorities at the time. Much careful consideration, he wrote, was given to the timing. The hotel had been reserved almost exclusively for government ministers, Conservative Party executive members and headquarters staff, with a limited number of lobby correspondents. The device was timed to go off when hotel staff would be least likely to be present. There was, he acknowledged, no guarantee that staff working late shifts in the bar and reception areas would escape. At the time, he wrote, he would have considered all conference attendees to be legitimate targets. Any civilian casualties would be deeply regrettable. At 3:06 on the morning of the 12th of October, it fired. The detonation drove upward through the building's structural core. The chimney stack, dislodged by the blast, fell through several floors. The central section of the hotel's facade collapsed inward. In the rooms above where the device had been placed, floors dropped onto the floors below, and those onto the next. The dust that filled the corridors wasn't the grey of a demolition site. It was white plaster, the powdered ceilings of rooms that no longer existed. Thatcher had left the bathroom of the Napoleon suite moments before the device fired. She was in the sitting room, working on her speech. The bathroom disintegrated. She wasn't in it. Norman Tebbit, the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, was found alive in the rubble. The rescue workers' account describes a space barely large enough for a single person to squeeze through to reach him. He had been buried by debris and was conscious when they got to him. His wife, Margaret, was found nearby. The ceiling of their room had come down on her. She sustained a spinal cord injury that left her permanently paralysed from the shoulders down, a condition she carried for the remaining 36 years of her life. 5 people were killed. Sir Anthony Berry, the Conservative MP for Southgate. Roberta Wakeham, wife of the government chief whip, John Wakeham. Jean Shattock, wife of the Western Area chairman of the Conservative Party. Eric Taylor, and Muriel MacLean, wife of Donald MacLean, the Conservative Party chairman in Scotland. She had been sleeping in room 629, the room where the bomb had been placed, where the void behind the bath panel had concealed it for 3 weeks. Thatcher's response, delivered to the conference hours later: all attempts to destroy democracy by terrorism will fail. The conference continued. The political symbolism was deliberate on both sides. The IRA had come within seconds of killing the Prime Minister and a significant portion of the cabinet. Thatcher's response was to carry on. In Cork, McGee waited for confirmation the device had detonated. His immediate response, he wrote, was relief. He described it as the relief of an operator who has spent weeks carrying responsibility for whether a device will function. It was, he acknowledged, the relief of a man who had tried to kill a prime minister and a cabinet. Only afterward did he allow what he called the full enormity of the action to enter his thinking. His future, he wrote, seemed irretrievably narrowed. He had known they would come for him. The investigation that followed was methodical. Forensic examiners working through the wreckage of room 629 recovered fingerprints from the hotel's registration cards. A match was identified to a known IRA member. Patrick McGee was arrested in Glasgow on the 22nd of June 1985 with 4 other IRA volunteers who were planning further operations in England. Martina Anderson was among those arrested with him. At his trial in September 1986, he received 8 life sentences, the judge describing him as a man of exceptional cruelty and inhumanity. The minimum tariff was 35 years before parole consideration. He served 14 years. He was released in June 1999 under the prisoner release provisions of the Good Friday Agreement. In his published account, McGee described Brighton's strategic significance within the Republican movement. Before Brighton, he wrote, not everyone was convinced that taking the war to England was the single most effective strategy available. Resources, arms, explosives, personnel, money were always scarce and hotly contested between different strategic priorities. After Brighton, in his assessment, the Republican movement was fully won over to the conviction that a sustained mainland campaign represented their best strategic asset. The bombing at the Grand Hotel, he wrote, had broken Britain's strategy of containment. The decade that followed was the operational proof of that conviction. On the 7th of February 1991, an IRA active service unit fired mortars from a transit van parked in Whitehall. The target was the Cabinet Office garden at Downing Street. John Major was chairing a War Cabinet meeting, a Gulf War briefing, the ground campaign against Iraq having opened days earlier, when the devices landed. The mortars struck the Cabinet Office garden. No cabinet members were killed. The attack didn't breach the building itself. But the attack demonstrated something more significant than the casualty count. The IRA had developed the technical capacity and targeting intelligence to deliver a mortar strike against the seat of government during a wartime cabinet meeting. The operational chain that placed those mortars in Whitehall, reconnaissance of the target's layout, device assembly, transport, emplacement in a commercial vehicle, firing sequence, had not been disrupted by British counterintelligence in time to prevent it. The IRA had not moved from nail bombs in public parks to mortaring the cabinet by accident. The cell restructuring of the late 1970s had produced exactly the durable, compartmentalized operational capability it was designed to produce. The Gulf War context wasn't incidental. The British government was managing a major overseas military commitment, with public attention and security resources invested in the Gulf. The IRA attacked the cabinet while it was being briefed on that war. 1 year later, on the 10th of April 1992, the day after the general election, a 1,000-pound truck bomb detonated outside the Baltic Exchange in St Mary Axe. The damage assessment reached £800 million. The financial press covered it in terms the IRA's economic doctrine had anticipated: insurance exposure, business relocation calculations, premium increases. The City of London's insurance market, already under strain, began examining the structural implications of insuring property in central London against attack. The Bishopsgate bomb came 13 months after that. On the 24th of April, 1993, an Iveco tipper truck, stolen in Newcastle-under-Lyme and repainted dark blue, was driven onto Bishopsgate by two IRA volunteers at approximately 9 in the morning. The vehicle had been loaded with a 1-ton ANFO bomb, manufactured by the IRA's South Armagh Brigade and smuggled into England, concealed beneath a layer of tarmac. The truck was parked outside 99 Bishopsgate, then the premises of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, by the junction with Wormwood Street and Chamomile Street. The volunteers left in a second vehicle. A series of telephone warnings were then delivered from a call box in Fork Hill, County Armagh, using a recognised IRA code word, stating there was a massive bomb and that a wide area should be cleared. 2 officers were already making inquiries about the truck when the warnings came. Police began evacuating the immediate area. At 10:27 a.m., the device detonated with a force equivalent to 1,200 kilograms of TNT. The blast expanded outward through Bishopsgate in a pressure wave that shattered glass as far as 500 metres. The sound was heard across the city. The NatWest Tower, then the city's tallest skyscraper at 52 stories, 600 feet above street level, had the east face of virtually every floor destroyed. The Daily Mail's description ran in the following morning's edition. Black gaps punched its 52 floors like a mouth full of bad teeth. The description was vivid because it was accurate. St Ethelburga's Church, a medieval structure 7 metres from the truck, collapsed entirely. 700 years of stone and mortar reduced to rubble by a device that cost the IRA approximately £3,000 to assemble and deploy. Documents from offices in multi-storey buildings were blown out through shattered windows and scattered across blocks of the city. Police eventually deployed shredders to destroy any sensitive material they could recover. 1.5 million square feet of office space was affected. Over 500 tons of glass broken. News photographer Ed Henty, who had ignored police warnings and moved toward the blast, was killed. 44 others were injured. The initial damage estimate was approximately £1 billion. The final reconstruction cost, after subsequent assessment, was £350 million. Either figure made Bishopsgate the most economically destructive single terrorist attack in British history to that point. The political response was swift and revealing. The Lord Mayor of London, Francis McWilliams, telephoned John Major directly. His message was recorded by Major in subsequent accounts. The City of London earned £17 billion last year for the nation as a whole. Its operating environment and future must be preserved. On the 3rd of July, 1993, the City of London Police introduced what became known as the Ring of Steel. Most routes into the square mile closed or made exit only. The 8 remaining entry points, staffed by armed officers at checkpoints, CCTV at every entry, over 70 police-controlled cameras monitoring the area. The system operated 24 hours a day. A camera watch scheme, launched in September 1993, pulled private company surveillance systems into the cordon. By 1996, over 1,000 cameras in 376 separate systems were operational in the city. A government-backed terrorism reinsurance pool, Pool Re, was created, drawing in over 115 insurance companies and 120 Lloyd's syndicates, with the government acting as reinsurer of last resort for losses over £75 million. The British state had, in practical terms, acknowledged that the IRA had forced a permanent restructuring of the physical and financial architecture of the National Financial District. Corporations subsequently prepared disaster recovery plans as standing operational procedure. The city's experience with IRA bombs meant that when the World Trade Center was attacked in September 2001, London's financial sector recovered faster than analysts had expected. A firm had circulated a report noting that 40% of businesses affected by the 1993 World Trade Center bombing had gone bankrupt within 2 years. The city had already learned what that looked like and built against it. The IRA's own statement appeared in the 29th of April edition of An Phoblacht, calling on the British establishment to seize the opportunity and take the steps needed for ending its futile and costly war in Ireland. A separate message went to non-American foreign-owned businesses in the city, warning them directly no one should be misled into underestimating the IRA's intention to mount future planned attacks into the political and financial heart of the British state. The author and journalist Ed Maloney later described the City of London bombing campaign as possibly the most successful military tactic the IRA had deployed since the beginning of the Troubles. John Major later argued the IRA had fundamentally miscalculated. Every time they bombed, he maintained, they hardened British negotiating positions rather than softening them. The IRA assumed the opposite. Both assessments can be simultaneously true. The IRA failed to shift British political will in the way they had calculated, and yet the Ring of Steel existed, Pool Re existed, and the financial architecture of the City of London had been permanently altered by bombs the IRA had constructed for thousands of pounds apiece. 6 weeks before Bishopsgate, the campaign had produced a different kind of consequence, one the IRA had not anticipated and couldn't manage. Saturday morning, the 20th of March 1993, was Mother's Day weekend. Bridge Street in Warrington's town centre was busy with the kind of crowd that fills a shopping street at mid-morning. Families, couples, people running errands. Warrington wasn't London. It wasn't a financial district or a government building. 2 devices had been left in litter bins on the street, with warnings given that were inadequate to achieve a proper evacuation before detonation. Jonathan Ball was 3 years old. He had been taken out by a babysitter to buy a Mother's Day card. He was standing near one of the bins when it detonated. He died instantly. Tim Parry was 12 years old. He had been in the area buying a pair of football shorts. The blast threw him against a wall. He died 5 days later from his injuries. The IRA's strategic doctrine required a credible distinction between military and political targets on one side and civilian casualties on the other. That distinction wasn't available on Bridge Street on a Saturday morning in March. The target wasn't symbolic. The casualties weren't adjacent to a legitimate target. There was no available framing that incorporated a 3-year-old buying a Mother's Day card into the logic of armed struggle against British rule. The reaction in the Irish Republic, marches in Dublin and other cities, condemnation across the political spectrum, expressions of revulsion from communities that provided the IRA's social and financial base, indicated that Warrington had damaged the Republican movement's standing on both sides of the Irish Sea simultaneously. In West Belfast, according to Brendan O'Brien's account in The Long War, people asked questions publicly that they had not asked before. The IRA's leadership understood what that meant. Warrington was the campaign's moral watershed, the moment when the gap between military doctrine and civilian reality became impossible to manage in public without cost. While the IRA adjusted its visible strategy, a different process had been running beneath it for 15 years. One that the IRA's leadership was beginning to understand wasn't confined to occasional operational failures. The Force Research Unit was a covert British Army intelligence unit established around 1980 and formally operational from 1982. Designed to recruit and run human agents inside both Republican and Loyalist paramilitary organisations. It sat within the Army Intelligence Corps at Teepval Barracks in Lisburn, operating alongside, and sometimes in direct tension with, MI5 and the RUC's Special Branch. Its motto, subsequently made public by a former member writing as Rob Lewis, was Fishers of Men. Gordon Kerr commanded the unit from 1987 to 1991. During his tenure, the FRU's most controversial parallel operation was running Brian Nelson as intelligence chief of the Ulster Defence Association, an agent the FRU had recruited and inserted into Loyalist leadership, who became implicated in approximately 15 murders, 15 attempted murders, and 62 conspiracies to murder. The De Silva Review, published in 2012 and focused on the murder of Belfast solicitor Pat Finucane, found that the UDA became substantially more lethal while Nelson was coordinating its intelligence, and that 85% of the UDA's intelligence at that period came from British security forces. Nelson was one strand of the FRU's operation. Stakeknife was another entirely. Freddie Scappaticci was born on the 12th of January 1946 in the Markets area of Belfast to a father who had emigrated from Italy in the 1920s. He was interned without trial in Long Kesh in August 1971 as part of Operation Demetrius alongside Gerry Adams and others who would become prominent in the Republican movement. He trained as a bricklayer. By 1980, he was a lead member of the IRA's Internal Security Unit. The ISU's function was counterintelligence. Its members vetted new recruits, debriefed volunteers released from British or RUC custody, investigated compromised operations, and identified informers within the IRA. Those identified as informers were interrogated. The unit would take a suspect to a house, usually rented, usually somewhere without neighbours close enough to hear, and begin. The interrogation could last hours or days. The technique, as described by former participants, relied less on physical force than on psychological pressure. The knowledge that there was no way out, that the IRA court-martial had already reached a conclusion, that the only variable was whether the suspect would confess voluntarily or be made to. The confession would be recorded on tape. The family would be played the recording after the fact. Then the volunteer would be walked out to a car or a field and shot in the back of the head. The unit's nickname was the Nutting Squad. The term was both vernacular and precise. Former IRA member Eamon Collins, in his memoir Killing Rage, recorded a conversation with Scappaticci, known to IRA comrades as Scap, about one such execution. The victim had confessed during interrogation and had been offered what appeared to be an amnesty. He was blindfolded and told he was being taken home. Scappaticci described walking him along railings and walls in the dark, the man stumbling and asking where they were, asking whether he had reached his house yet. Scappaticci told him, "Not yet. Walk on some more." John Joe McGee, who was the ISU leader at the time, supplied the punchline. "And then you shot him in the back of the head." Both men, Collins recorded, burst out laughing. This was the man the Force Research Unit had placed at the centre of the IRA's internal security apparatus. Scappaticci's first contact with British intelligence is alleged to have begun in 1978 through the RUC's Special Branch, after he was questioned in connection with a construction industry tax fraud. Fearful of prosecution, he reportedly offered to become a low-level informer. His handling was later assumed by the Force Research Unit. According to Ian Hurst, the FRU operative who subsequently wrote a book on the subject under the pseudonym Martin Ingram, Scappaticci's value as a high-grade asset became apparent in 1982 when he was detained for drink driving and used his intelligence relationship to secure his release. His codename within the FRU was Stakeknife. His primary handler was Peter Jones. MI5 set up a dedicated office solely to manage Stakeknife's intelligence stream. The Army's head of intelligence briefed on his material every 4 to 6 weeks. General Sir John Willsey, who commanded the British Army in Northern Ireland in the early 1990s, later described him as the golden egg, the single most valuable intelligence asset the Army ran against the IRA during the entire conflict. The Kenova final report, published in March 2024, found that MI5 was closely involved throughout the operation, regularly briefed with automatic sight of all Stakeknife's intelligence, aware of his involvement in serious criminality. MI5 had previously described its role as peripheral. The report found 3,517 intelligence reports generated by the agent. The MI5 Director General subsequently offered sympathies to victims and families, and an independent review found no material had been deliberately withheld, though additional files were discovered in April 2024, after what the report described as a serious organisational failure. The ethical architecture of the operation was this. The IRA's head of counterintelligence, the man whose entire function was to find and eliminate British informers within the movement, was himself a British informer. Every IRA volunteer that Scappaticci identified as a suspected informer presented the FRU with a choice: intervene and expose the asset, or allow the IRA's process to proceed. The FRU didn't always intervene. When it did, it could sometimes redirect suspicion elsewhere. In October 1987, the UDA shot dead Francisco Notarantonio in his bed in Ballymurphy. Notarantonio was 66 years old and had played no active IRA role since the early 1970s. He was selected as the murder target, it was subsequently alleged, because FRU agent Brian Nelson provided his name to the UDA to divert internal IRA suspicion away from Scappaticci, who had come under scrutiny. An innocent man was killed to protect an informer inside the organisation that was supposed to prevent such killings. The case of Joseph Fenton illustrates how these mechanics worked in practice. Fenton was an estate agent on the Falls Road, whose properties the IRA used as safe houses, arms dumps and meeting places. RUC's Special Branch had recruited him in 1982 after threatening prosecution for earlier offences. Over the mid-1980s, Fenton's safe houses were covertly fitted with listening devices. Over 20 IRA members were arrested in possession of firearms. Several bombing units were intercepted as they travelled to targets. Fenton came under internal IRA suspicion in 1985, but deflected it by providing the names of 2 other informers, a married couple named Marn, who were subsequently executed. By late 1988, suspicion returned when 4 IRA members were arrested at an Andersonstown house being used as a mortar factory. Fenton was one of only a handful of people who knew that address. The ISU's investigation concluded there was a link between compromised operations and houses Fenton had provided. His estate agency was also examined. The sudden ability to open a business in the early 1980s couldn't be explained. By early 1989, he was working as a taxi driver. The agency had closed when his landlord evicted him for unpaid rent. He was abducted on the 24th of February 1989, taken to a house in the Lenadoon area. He confessed. He was found dead in a nearby alley on the 26th of February, shot 4 times. At Fenton's funeral, his local priest, Father Tom Toner, spoke publicly about what had happened. To you, the IRA, and all who support you, we have to say that we feel dirty today. Scappaticci, according to subsequent accounts, was involved in the interrogation that preceded the execution. His FRU handlers had known Fenton was in danger. They had not intervened. Operation Kenova, established by the Police Service of Northern Ireland in 2016 under John Butcher, then Chief Constable of Bedfordshire, examined 101 murders and abductions linked to the IRA unit in which Scappaticci operated. It found that time and again, intelligence wasn't acted upon when acting would have exposed him. It concluded that more lives were probably lost than saved through his operation. General Willsey had claimed Stakeknife saved hundreds and hundreds of lives. Operation Kenova's assessment was that the number of lives saved was between high single figures and low double figures. The compound effect of Stakeknife, combined with other agents the FRU and RUC Special Branch were running at multiple levels of the IRA, was that by the early 1990s, the IRA's operational security was functionally compromised at its most sensitive points. Operations requiring significant planning, reconnaissance, device assembly, transport chains, generated intelligence that moved through IRA structures and back to British handlers before the operations could be executed. In March 1994, the IRA mounted 3 separate mortar attacks on Heathrow Airport, on the 9th, the 11th and the 13th of the month. All 3 failed to detonate. 3 launches across 5 days, 3 failures, against an airport whose operational disruption would have been enormous in terms of media impact and economic consequence. The IRA leadership's internal conclusion was that the devices had been technically interfered with. Whether that assessment was accurate remains unconfirmed. No British authority has acknowledged technical interference, and the specific sabotage claim isn't established in any confirmed primary record. But 3 consecutive mortar failures from an organisation with a documented track record of successful mortar attacks on government buildings forced a question the leadership couldn't answer with confidence. If the failures weren't mechanical accidents, how far into the operational chain had British intelligence reached? The question wasn't purely theoretical. Brighton had produced an arrest within 8 months. Other ASUs had been intercepted en route to targets. Devices had been found before detonation. The accumulated pattern, even without a definitive answer on Heathrow, was of an organisation that could plan and execute, but couldn't consistently maintain operational security against an intelligence apparatus that appeared to have visibility everywhere that mattered. The Hume-Adams dialogue, the back channel between SDLP leader John Hume and Gerry Adams, facilitated in part by Redemptorist priest Father Alec Reid, had been running since 1988. It produced, in December 1993, the Downing Street Declaration, a framework for political engagement that committed both governments to supporting whatever democratic outcome the people of Ireland chose. In 1994, the IRA Army Council circulated an internal document referred to by the initials TUAS, which some read as totally unarmed strategy, and others as tactical use of armed struggle. The disputed meaning was itself a form of political management, a leadership preparing a transition without fully announcing one to its own membership. The acronym's deliberate ambiguity allowed the Army Council to describe the document differently to different audiences within the movement. On the 31st of August 1994, the IRA declared a complete cessation of military operations. The British government's confidence in taking that ceasefire seriously, in treating it as a genuine strategic shift rather than a tactical pause, drew on what British intelligence knew about the IRA's operational capacity, its internal debates, and the calculations of its leadership. The IRA had made a rational assessment that the political track offered better returns than a military campaign they could no longer plan in genuine secrecy. The ceasefire was, in part, a rational response to a war they had concluded was becoming operationally unwinnable on the terms they needed it to be winnable. The first ceasefire held for 17 months. The reasons for its collapse were political rather than military. The British government under John Major demanded IRA decommissioning as a precondition for Sinn Féin's entry into all-party talks. US Senator George Mitchell's review produced a framework, the Mitchell Principles, for proceeding without that precondition. Major declined to implement it before the 1997 general election. The IRA Army Council's conclusion was that the British were using decommissioning to prevent political engagement, not to structure it. Jonathan Powell, who served as Tony Blair's Chief of Staff through the negotiations, later wrote in Great Hatred, Little Room that the British demand for decommissioning before talks was interpreted by Republicans as evidence that the British weren't negotiating in good faith. Both sides were, in Powell's account, making rational calculations based on incompatible assumptions about what the other side actually wanted. On the 9th of February 1996, at 6 in the evening, the IRA announced the end of its ceasefire, with what it described as great reluctance. A large bomb at South Quay, Canary Wharf, detonated that evening, killing 2 people and causing substantial structural and economic damage to London's secondary financial district. The device carried the same financial logic as Bishopsgate: high economic impact, high visibility in the markets, calibrated to demonstrate that operational capacity remained intact and that the political cost of failing to engage remained real. The Canary Wharf bomb wasn't the opening of a new full campaign. It was a demonstration that the IRA could still reach the British financial system when it chose to. A signal that the cost of failing to negotiate remained higher than the cost of engagement. The distinction between a return to full campaign and a targeted political signal was understood on both sides. The IRA wasn't abandoning the political track. It was attempting to restore leverage it believed it had surrendered without equivalent gain. The second ceasefire came on the 20th of July 1997, following Labour's election victory. Tony Blair's government moved Sinn Féin into proximity talks without the decommissioning precondition. This ceasefire held through the negotiations that produced the Good Friday Agreement, signed on the 10th of April 1998. Its prisoner release provisions applied to paramilitaries on both sides convicted of offences connected to the conflict. Patrick Magee was released in June 1999. On the 11th of May 2003, 4 newspapers named Freddie Scappaticci as the British agent codenamed Stakeknife: the Sunday Herald in Glasgow, the Sunday Tribune, the Sunday World, and the Irish edition of The People. The previous Friday, he had been moved from Belfast to a safe house in England by the Ministry of Defence. He denied the allegations publicly. He launched an unsuccessful legal action to compel the British government to publicly state he wasn't their agent. The government's response was the standard formulation: neither confirm nor deny. He lived in various locations under witness protection: Cheshire, Manchester, eventually a gated community in London, later Guildford. His name changed to Frank Cowley. The neither confirm nor deny policy remained in place through every subsequent investigation. It remained in place through the Stevens Inquiry's third report of 2003. It remained in place through Operation Kenova, which examined 101 murders and abductions connected to the unit in which Scappaticci operated, generated a £40 million investigation, and found that MI5 had been closely involved throughout his operation, regularly briefed with automatic sight of all his intelligence, aware of his involvement in serious criminality, despite having previously described its role as peripheral. It remained in place through the Operation Kenova final report of March 2024, which concluded that the refusal to confirm or deny whether Scappaticci was Stakeknife was having a profound and severe impact on victims and families, legitimate public discussion, and public confidence in state authorities. John Butcher, who led the Kenova investigation until his appointment as PSNI Chief Constable, described the continuing government refusal as bordering on farce, arguing it protected no one and that there was nothing in the legal arguments available to the government that would stop a minister from simply authorising the naming. The Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, in February 2026, recommended the government formally name Stakeknife. The government hasn't done so. Freddie Scappaticci died on the 20th of March 2023, aged 77, in England. His death wasn't publicly announced until after his burial. He died without being charged. Operation Kenova's findings were unambiguous on the operational arithmetic. 3,517 intelligence reports generated, 101 murders and abductions investigated. Time and again, intelligence not acted upon to protect the asset. More lives probably lost than saved. The FRU's own assessment of hundreds and hundreds of lives saved was, in Kenova's analysis, false and wildly exaggerated. The techniques the FRU developed, deep penetration of the enemy's counterintelligence apparatus, the long asset at the centre of hostile internal security, the tolerance of associated criminality to protect strategic access, didn't remain in Northern Ireland. They became doctrine, applied in subsequent theatres from Helmand to elsewhere. What those theatres cost and what was permitted within them remains subject to the familiar formulation: neither confirm nor deny. The Provisional 1RA's Mainland campaign killed approximately 175 people on British soil between 1973 and 1997. It cost the British state somewhere between £5 and £8 billion in damages, security architecture and intelligence operations. It ended in a negotiated political settlement that the IRA's volunteers in 1972 would have rejected as defeat. Patrick McGee, who placed the Brighton bomb, is still alive. He gives talks now, sometimes alongside Jo Berry, the daughter of the man he killed in room 629, Sir Anthony Berry MP, Conservative member for Southgate. The two first met on the 24th of November 2000 in Dublin, arranged through an intermediary 17 months after McGee's release from prison. He had been working casual construction work that week, finishing early on a Friday before making the journey. He had misgivings about it. He described viewing the encounter more initially for its political significance than its human one. A civilian victim of an IRA operation had sought direct contact with the volunteer most publicly identified with that action. Then he met her. They have met several dozen times since, giving talks together under the Building Bridges for Peace initiative. Their 2021 memoir documents what that dialogue required of both of them, what it required McGee to acknowledge that he couldn't hide behind the IRA's institutional responsibility, and what it required Berry to do with a grief that had no clean resolution available. McGee continued in those talks and interviews to defend the strategic logic of what he had done. He expressed remorse for the deaths of civilians. He didn't accept that he had been wrong to pursue the campaign. Those two positions coexist without reconciliation in the public record he has created. The bomb that nearly killed Margaret Thatcher made him, in the end, into a person who has to explain what he did. That, in the IRA's strategic terms, is what they wanted. It's also, in any other terms, the price of admission to a peace that the dead didn't get. Subscribe for more stories like this.